Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alexandra Bell, and I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Today, we'll be having a conversation on a topic core to the Bulletin's mission, exploring the complex history of nuclear weapons from their creation to the decision-making around them and the aftermath when they were used. August marks the 80th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is a time to reflect on the legacy of the Manhattan Project, to remember those who it affected, and understand how the era shaped our time. The Bulletin was founded by scientists working at the Chicago Metallurgical Lab portion of the Manhattan Project as a response to the creation of nuclear weapons. The Bulletin became and remains a major outlet for scientists to address the challenges we're facing together more broadly. We continue to exist because of our donors, subscribers to our magazine, and the public at large who feel that existential risks we face must be researched, debated, and discussed in a civil, open forum. So thank you to all of you who support our work. Please consider getting involved if you can. Our website is the right starting point for more opportunities, and please consider subscribing. Today's event will explore the story of Luis Alvarez, one of the Manhattan Project scientists who played a very major role in the development and usage of the bombs in Japan. Through his story, we will understand more about the era and also the effects we still experience today. We would like to thank the Atomic Heritage Foundation and the DePaul Humanities Center for their partnership today. Finally, we have assembled an amazing group of experts to illuminate the story, and I'll briefly introduce them now. Their full bios are on our website. First, we have Cynthia C. Kelly. Cynthia, who goes by Cindy, is the founder and president of the Atomic Heritage Foundation. Before creating the foundation, she served for over 20 years as a senior executive with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection Agency, receiving the Distinguished Career Service Award for her time at both agencies. Next, we welcome Dr. Yuki Miyamoto, who is the Professor of Religious Studies and Director of Humanities Center at DePaul University. Yuki is an ethicist whose work centers on the nuclear discourse and environmental ethics through the framework of comparative ethics. Her monograph, Beyond the Mushroom Cloud, Commemoration, Religion, and Responsibility After Hiroshima, examines the way in which victims of the atomic bombings came to terms with the nuclear attacks. And finally, we have novelist and critic Alec Navala Lee. Among his full-length works, Alec has written a biography of Buckminster Fuller, along with an exploration of the golden age of science fiction. His work has been featured in many outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, and The Atlantic. And he is the author of the new book, Collisions, A Physicist's Journey from Hiroshima to the Death of Dinosaurs, which is a biography of Nobel Prize-winning physicist Luis Alvarez, and the reason we're here today. So let's get started. Alec, because you wrote the book that prompted this discussion today, let's start with you. Why did you choose to highlight Luis Alvarez, and why now?
Well, thanks, Alex, and thank you for helping to organize this event, which I'm very excited to be a part of. So this is the book Collisions, which came out in June. And I really wrote it for two reasons. Okay. The obvious one is that Luis Alvarez is clearly an extraordinary scientist who deserved a full-length biography. And the fact that there hadn't really been one until now, still amazes me because today we're going to focus on his role in the Manhattan Project and as the lead scientific observer at the bombing of Hiroshima, which is a huge story in itself. But beyond that, Alvarez was a Nobel Prize winner for developing the bubble chamber, which played a huge role in the development of high energy physics. He worked on really incredible problems like investigating the JFK assassination and X-raying the pyramids for hidden chambers. And most famously, perhaps, he, at the very end of his life, worked with his son Walter to demonstrate that the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs was caused by an asteroid impact, which is one of the most, incredible mysteries that anyone has ever solved. So clearly an interesting person, all right, and a genius, on every level. But the other reason I wanted to talk about Alvarez and write this book, and I think it's very timely, is that I'm also very aware of his limitations. Alvarez was incredibly ingenious, brilliant on every level. He could, come up with like good ideas sitting by himself in a room, but was also able to like run these like big engineering projects. So if you have like a scientific problem, he's the kind of guy you wanted on your team. But when it came to issues that were a little bit less obvious, like a little bit less amenable to those tools. Things like on the highest level, politics, issues of nuclear deterrence, things like the Oppenheimer trial, where he was one of the or the Oppenheimer hearing, where he was one of the government's witnesses against Oppenheimer, down to like the level of personal interactions. He was an incredibly difficult person to work with, and I think a lot of his family and colleagues would agree with this. So Alvarez, had his limitations, all right, and to me, he is the ideal vehicle for exploring an issue that I think is like really interesting and central to my work, which is the limits of intelligence and how the tools that work so well in one sphere, can end up being less than ideal in others.
Hmm. Thank you very much for that summation, and look forward to digging in further as we go. Yuki, as a scholar and a second generation Hibakusha, you've written extensively about the ways we remember and commemorate the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What role do you think an understanding of the people behind the Manhattan Project plays in our broader understanding of this history?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and to co-sponsor this wonderful event. And thank you, Alec, for introducing me to this side of the Manhattan Project, which I had no knowledge of. I very much enjoyed reading it, and the meaning and understanding of the Manhattan Project. It is, even though the book is well written, I enjoyed reading it. It was a little bit difficult to read emotionally, especially the pages describing the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as Alex nicely introduced me, I'm also, I have this familial relationship with this historical event. If I may able to indulge myself in talking about my family history, my mom was 6 years old at the time of the bombing, and she was a mile away from the hypocenter. But that was a kind of official story. She could have been because she didn't tell me about her experience. I learned everything from my aunt, who is older than my mother. And according to her, my mom was at the elementary school, which was even closer to the hypocenter, where hundreds kids were instantly killed. So we had no idea how my mom survived, which I'm very much regretting to this day that I didn't ask her. But so I didn't know much about her younger days, but in her 30s, she developed Meniere disease. And in her 40s, she had to get the kind of blood booster shots every other week because her body was not able to produce healthy blood cells. And in her 50s, she was diagnosed with cancer and she passed away at the age of 62. So as long as I remember, she was suffering from some kind of ailment. And plus, my cousin, who was born 10 years after the bombing, but she was living in a mile away from the hypocenter, so could be because of the residual radiation, she developed the autoimmune illness in her 30s and bedridden for 2 decades and passed away in her 50s. And so growing up in Hiroshima, everyone was to some extent, related to this historical event. So coming from that perspective, it is difficult to understand. On one point, it is difficult to understand why people are so enthusiastic about this weapon, which killed so many people instantly and following years more. But at the same time, it's also, I think Alec was able to communicate with the readers in a way that how scientists' minds work and how much money was spent and kind of a drive that they had, which in academia we have to some extent, we can relate. In terms of understanding the Manhattan Project, I think it is difficult to read, but also I acknowledge, which I would like to talk later, that Japan was also developing the atomic bombs.
Yuki, thank you so much for those personal insights, and I think it's incredibly important as we discuss the history of all of this, that we never can disconnect the science and the sort of mechanics of World War II from the actual human effects of the choices that we made at the time. And I think it helps us better inform decisions today. So thank you for those insights. Cindy, could you share why you started the Atomic Heritage Foundation, and how would you place Luis Alvarez in this larger history? And as Alex said, you know, why wasn't he and hasn't been as noticed as some of the other Manhattan Project scientists have been?
Well, there is a pantheon of Manhattan Project scientists. Everybody knows Groves and Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard for various reasons. But in my exploration, there are thousands of people, of whom Louis Alvarez is a great exemplar, who were extraordinarily creative, resourceful, dedicated, and determined to develop this science. They were a great innovative group that still, as long as they lived, they were creating new things, exploring different aspects of cutting edge science, which is remarkable. I interviewed over 350 Manhattan Project veterans. I've read, we have another, 250 interviews with them that we found, some of them in the bowels of the Boston University archives, and they're all online now for people to learn. Why did I found the Atomic Heritage Foundation? Because this history was going to be forgotten. It's hard to believe, but I had been at the Department of Energy and learned that the last remaining Manhattan Project buildings where they actually worked, like, these are located 6 miles from downtown, high on the mesas, where they struggled with how to actually build the gadget and tested the gun type bomb in the fields out there and so forth. These buildings had been sitting since the 50s, virtually abandoned. And it was time to clean up. The Congress appropriated money and insisted the Department of Energy was not exempt from cleaning up the weapons sites. And so they got to it. Good for them, but they weren't going to spare any of them. I mean, all 50 were going to go down. So I got involved as a Department of Energy employee and got the department to enter the sweepstakes that the National Park Service had in 1997, 98, to get a Save America's Treasures grant. They were designed to preserve federal properties that were very significant to our history, but in danger of being lost. So the department submitted 7 different properties from its various sites, Hanford, Idaho, Rocky Flats, and of course, Los Alamos. And 2 of them won grants for $1.3 million together. And this is great, except that somebody had to bring in dollar for dollar matching grants, or this was going to go nowhere. So anyway, it happened. That was at a time that I had the numbers to retire early from the federal government. And I thought this will be a segue to my next real job. It's only been 25 years later. I find the whole subject matter so fascinating. And there was a lot of interest in preserving this history in the hometowns in Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and Hanford. And they galvanized political interest. It took 11 years, but we managed to get legislation to create a park. So there's now a Manhattan Project National Historical Park. And I'm thrilled that Alec has written this wonderful book about Louis Alvarez. There can't be enough books. It's funny, people use the term Manhattan Project as if, well, let's have another one, thinking that this might be quite easy. We'll solve the problem of cancer. We'll get to Mars sooner, but it's not so easy. And I think having the inside story, as Alex has told it, And as people now can read on our websites and learn at the park sites, is a very important thing.
Thanks for that, Cindy, that overview. And I really appreciate that all of you are bringing in a historical perspective and from different angles. And so let's dig in on Luis Alvarez a little bit more. Alec, Alvarez seemed to really relish his job, his calling. I know you remarked in the book he was among sort of the last era of scientists going into physics when it was considered, almost heroic, that type of a job. So he was always pushing himself, uh, but he didn't necessarily let the questions surrounding some of these scientific endeavors, the philosophical obstacles really get in his way. So can you reflect a little bit on that and talk about some of his larger accomplishments during the war itself?
Yeah, I think, I can start by kind of explaining how Alvarez ended up in this story in the first place. So the very short version is that after World War II began, but before Pearl Harbor, when it was very clear that America would enter the war at some point, Alvarez was recruited from his job at the Berkeley Radiation Lab to go work on the MIT radar project. And Ernest Lawrence, his boss, selected Alvarez and one other person at Macmillan as kind of his top picks to send to this crucial project to develop airborne radar. And it wasn't because they were experts in radar; they hadn't even heard of it, but they were ingenious, hands-on scientists you trusted to learn the material very quickly and come up with solutions. And this is what happened. So he goes to MIT. He develops, some incredible radar tools that end up being very important. But all the while, he is in touch with Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer is also a colleague at UC Berkeley. They know each other very well. They're friendly. And Oppenheimer also sees Alvarez as being the kind of person he wants on the Manhattan Project, which, by 1942 is kind of overtaking radar as being the place where, the most accomplished scientists are working. So Alvarez is recruited again to join the Manhattan Project. And again, like his background is not necessarily in these questions. He's just sort of seen as a very versatile, useful person. So my favorite example of this is that he is assigned to work on the implosion problem. So basically, with the uranium bomb, you can just kind of use the gun method. You shoot two pieces of radium together to create a critical mass. But this does not work for plutonium. Plutonium requires a faster assembly, and it ends up being based on what's called the implosion method, which is you have a sphere of plutonium that is then squeezed down to a smaller sphere by explosives that can create a critical mass. And this is very hard because it has to be precise. It has to be symmetrical, because if there's any asymmetry in the way the sphere is compressed, you end up with a fizzle, like a failed bomb. And so what Alvarez does is he's not an explosives expert, but he goes and learns about explosives, comes up with a design for the detonators that allow all these explosive lenses, 32 of them, to go off within less than a microsecond. All right, and this is a huge deal. This essentially makes the plutonium bomb possible. And again, he just kind of like is trying to figure these things out on the fly in a way that I find very it's always appealing. But for him, these are technical problems. He does not he has seen firsthand pilots go out mostly in the UK on these very risky bombing missions. And he feels that this has granted him a perspective on the war that his colleagues might lack, because he's kind of been near the front lines. He understands what he thinks the human cost on the Allied side. And so, yeah, he has no question in his mind that if we can use the bomb to, end the war, that it's worth it, and he essentially, that's the stance he has on the day the bomb is dropped, and it never changes. He always steadfastly defends the use of the two bombs on Japan until the day he dies. And this is, I think, very revealing. I think Alvarez was the kind of person who, once he had made up his mind, he was kind of implacable. Like, he would not, change his mind very quickly, and he expected you to see his point of view very, and if you didn't, he could be very hard on the people around him. So, maybe I'll pause there, because later I want to talk a bit more about how he ended up at Hiroshima. But I think that this is very revealing, that for him, like these issues, at least the way he described them, they were not ambiguous. To him, it was a very clear-cut decision to drop the bomb, and he never changed his mind on that point.
Actually, let's talk now about how he ended up in Hiroshima. It's something that I think people don't necessarily know, that one of the scientists from the Manhattan Project was there in a plane.
Yeah, this is actually a pretty big deal. The idea that Alvarez is the highest ranking member of the scientific team to see the bombing firsthand. All right. And he's there because he wants to be, right? He has, essentially wrapped up his work on the Manhattan Project. The Trinity test is about to succeed. But he wants to be there when the bomb is used. All right. And so what happens is that he goes to Oppenheimer, and the two of them decide that someone needs to be there to measure the explosive energy of the bomb. The issue is that, so there are 3 bombs, all right? So there are 2 plutonium bombs and 1 uranium bomb. One of the plutonium bombs is the Trinity test, right? And so they can measure that, very easily because it's being detonated in controlled conditions in the desert. The issue with the uranium bomb is they only have 1, all right? It's only going to be used once against Japan. And so they need to find a way to measure how powerful it is in the field, which is much harder than doing it, on a proving ground. So Alvarez, assigned himself this problem, and he eventually realizes that the only thing you can measure, from the air is the blast, like the blast pressure of the bomb. It's like a shock wave. And he realizes that you can treat this as a sound wave. So if you have a microphone, you can use that microphone to pick up, the shock wave, and then you can look at the wave that it produces on an oscilloscope screen, analyze it, and you can determine within pretty wide error bars like how powerful the explosion was. So he actually figures out this with some help from other physicists, a parachute gauge. It's like a cylindrical gauge that contains 2 microphones. And the idea is that you can follow the bomber in a observation plane. After the bomb is dropped, you can then drop these parachute gauges, which when the bomb goes off, the microphones will pick up the shock wave, transmit that information to an oscilloscope in the observation plane. You can film the screen of the oscilloscope with a 16mm film camera, and then take that camera back to be developed and analyzed to see how how powerful the explosion was. So he develops this technology expressly to give him an excuse to go on that mission. I think this is a key point. He didn't have to be there. Originally, the idea was to hand off these tools to officers who could handle the observations, but he said, no, I need to be on that plane. He makes a case that only the scientists who built the gauges are qualified to run the operation. And so that's how he ends up in the Great Artiste, which is the observation plane that accompanies the Enola Gay on the bombing of Hiroshima.
Now, Yuki, one of the things that I didn't know about that Alec talks about in his book is Alvarez's attempt to reach out to a Japanese physicist that he knew, Ryo Kichi Sagane, warning him about the bomb and urging him to use, his influence to persuade Japanese leadership to surrender. So that was an interesting anecdote I wasn't aware of, but also an indication of the connection between physicists at the time, a connection I think that continues today. So can you talk a little bit about what the conversation was in Japan at the time about this kind of scientific endeavor? And obviously the letter did not get to its intended recipient, but would it have made a difference?
Right, thank you. I didn't know about this letter either, so I thank Alec for writing about this so that I was able to make some connections among the things which I had known before. But I didn't know much about Sagane, to whom the letter was addressed. And Ryokichi Sagane, he actually studied under Lawrence. So I think that's where the connection was made, and that was around in 1935. And he came back in 1938 to Japan and immediately involved with NI project or NIGO project. That's what it's called. And that's about making the atomic bomb. And Sagane was also making, actually, he was able to make cyclotron. So I think that's also another connections with Alvarez. And there were actually two projects going on. As I said earlier, Japan was also engaged in producing the atomic bombs. And there were two projects going on. One is the one which I just talked about. Sagane was involved. And famous physicist Nishina Yoshio was the leader of this project, the NIGO project, which was in Tokyo. And interestingly, back then, Army and Navy were not in good terms. Navy was more informed and explored a larger part of the globe, so they knew a lot more about Britain's and other Allied powers' equipment, and they didn't think that Japan had a chance to win. So they were trying to bring this to a more peaceful end. Whereas Army, which was not well informed as much as the Navy, and they were more determined to keep going, continue the war. And they were the ones who had more power in the administration back then. And this NIGO project was carried out by the Army support and located in Tokyo. The other one, actually Navy, who was also trying to bring this war to an end, but at the same time was supporting the atomic bomb project based in Kyoto. And this was called F Project. And actually, there was a movie came out in 2021. The English title is Gift of Fire, and describing those Kyoto scientists, basically like the students and graduate students and very young scientists trying to work on the atomic bombs. But it's striking how little resource they have. They actually walked out to pottery to get some soil, which might have some uranium in it. And they carry the backpack and then came back to the lab and trying to refine the soil to extract uranium. That's the level that they were working on, as opposed to the Manhattan Project, which had $2 billion as a budget. So, by the way, Gift of Fire, which is rated 6.4 out of 10 on IMDb rating. So I don't know if I should recommend it, but it is fascinating from that point of view, how little resource they had, but still kept going. And the letter, going back to the letter, which Alvarez wrote, it reached, but it was in September. So everything was over. And I was fascinated by the way that the letter was sent. I've never heard of this radio sound.
Yeah,
Maybe
can I break in just because I mean first of all, Yuki, thank you. This was very interesting. I actually didn't know much about Sagane, and this is all good information for me too. Just to quickly explain what this letter was. So Alvarez has witnessed the Hiroshima bombing, is back on Tinian waiting for the Nagasaki mission, or what becomes the Nagasaki mission. And he has the idea of writing a letter to Sagane, who is someone he knows from Berkeley, and taping it to the parachute gauges. So he's got access to these gauges that he's going to drop over the bombing site by parachute. And he actually writes out a letter and Scotch tapes it, 3 copies to the 3 gauges, and they are dropped after the Nagasaki bomb. And the letters essentially say, as a physicist, please tell the high command that this is just the beginning. You understand that if we have dropped 2 bombs, it means that we have the material, to make more. And this is something that only a physicist could convey, right? And the question is, did he really think that these letters would reach Sagane? I don't really know. I think at this point, Alvarez is kind of acting with one eye toward history. And I think he sent a message maybe because he thought it would be received, but also because he wanted to be able to say later on that he had done this.
Thank you. Yep, it reached a little too late, whatever the intention Alvarez had. But even if the letter had reached to him before August 15th, which was the day when the emperor made an announcement to end the war or to admit the loss of the war, I have doubts that the letter would have affected. As I said, the army was very gung-ho. They were like the slogan was, we are fighting, we continue to fight until the last soul dies. That's the kind of mentality back then. So I'm not sure how much connections that those scientists and Sagane had with military, especially army officials. And even though his project was supported by the army, and also the short period of time. So I wondered.
No, and Alec, thank you for that, Yuki. And Alec, that's an interesting idea. Was he purposely trying to reach him, or was he trying to sort of set up a view here? But Cindy, can you help us expand on this? This was the interchange between physicists at the time about the ethics and the bigger picture of what they were doing was actually quite complex, and to the point of actually post bombings, factions forming among these physicists working on these issues. So can you talk a little bit about that and the history of physicists taking very different views on what would come next? Oh, you're on mute, Cindy.
There we go. I don't want to leave the impression that the physicists were disunited in their efforts. Everything I've read is that they were full bore on the work ahead of them. And Richard Feynman said they just got so involved in making sure this project succeeded that they didn't think about all of these questions. And Leona Woods Marshall, right-hand woman to Enrico Fermi, said, in war, you don't stop and ask, is this the right thing? I mean, this is war, 70 million people. They didn't know that, but that's, often cited as the account of how many people have lost their lives in this 6-year war. 7, depending on when you count the beginning. But at any rate, I think that the scientists kind of were of two minds, and you see more of this as it's clear that the war is going to end and has ended. One is that we need to get civilian control of this. We need openness. We need to share information as we had before the war. The high energy physics was an international discipline. Oppenheimer and Werner Heisenberg were in the same classes, learning about this from Max Planck and James Franck and others over in Germany. They all knew each other. This was a very collegial group in a way, in that they had known each other before the war quite well, or at least many of them. What happened after the war was the divide was really over going beyond the atomic bomb. Some of them thought that at the end of the war, that would be it. They'd close down the laboratories. Everybody would go back to academia, wherever they came from. Some of them did just that. That was enough of this military work. Nuclear weapons. They even decided they would have nothing to do with nuclear anything, power for peaceful uses or not. Others of them were gung-ho on the super bomb. And that's the group that Alvarez fell in, because it was Ernest Lawrence, who ran the Berkeley lab, was a great proponent of this, as was Edward Teller, who later was behind starting the second laboratory in California, weapons laboratory at Livermore. At any rate, so that was one faction that it couldn't see the end of producing these weapons. They were important to the strength of the country. They figured, and they thought they had a lot of talent to bring to this task. can't go into the whole psychology, but they were clearly of one mind. And the other mind were those who later went on to, lobby hard against the legislation that would have had the Atomic Energy Commission under military control, and went instead for the so-called McMahon bill, which eventually passed, to put it in civilian control as we have today. And they then, worked through the UN, United Nations, to try to have international control of weapons and Oppenheimer and nuclear materials. And Oppenheimer worked very hard on a draft of the United States presentation that kind of got a little scrambled in its in the hands of Bernard Baruch, who was the one who delivered it. And it was delivered such that the Soviets would never accept. So it was dead on arrival, but it was a try. I mean, they clearly recognized that we had to do something other than business as usual in, building our arsenals that were only going to lead to the destruction of civilization. They realized the immense power of these, having witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and wanted to put an end to it. So there were two very divergent ideas.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cindy. Alec, you write about this in your book, that Alvarez, while he sort of viewed that, this kind of power, this kind of weaponry would actually bring countries together and prevent further war. The sort of view that Alfred Nobel had after the invention of dynamite, that this would finally get us there, and that what is at stake would finally be clear to countries around the world. Obviously, that did not come to pass. But at the same time, he wrote that he felt his colleagues didn't have enough, firsthand experience of the war to really comprehend why the bomb was essential. So could you expand on his views there and why he sort of went in one direction as opposed to the other?
Yeah, I think we should, try to explain why Alvarez thought the bombings were justified, which I think is an interesting point. And just to be clear, I'm just conveying what he writes. This is not necessarily my view, but this is what he says. So he compares it to what he calls a fire break. So the analogy that he likes to use is to the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which basically causes this huge fire. Firefighters can't stop the fire, because the water mains have been destroyed. And so they end up dynamiting houses in the fire's path to prevent it from spreading to the rest of the city. And he says, this is what Hiroshima and Nagasaki did. And the analogy, the fire is not a theoretical thing. It is the bombers on Tinian and these islands that are going out on endless raids, as he is working on this project and firebombing Japan. All right, so this is an ongoing campaign, leads to hundreds of thousands of casualties and deaths. And he says that if we hadn't dynamited, metaphorically, Hiroshima and Nagasaki to prevent the fire from spreading, that firebombing by the Americans would have continued. All right, Hiroshima would have been firebombed, Nagasaki would have been firebombed. The death toll would have been equally great. Other cities would have followed. And so to him, it's not just this people talk about, we had to stop the invasion or we had to stop, some future campaign. But no, I mean, this was ongoing. He saw it happening while he was, getting the bomb ready. And so to him, he says that we eventually saved lives by ending the war before that firebombing campaign could proceed to its, conclusion. I think that's an interesting argument. But, again, it's the logic of war. Right, this is the logic of war in which you're essentially committing one war crime, we might say, to prevent another from happening. And so even if you accept that reasoning, it's still horrifying that Alvarez thought that this was, kind of the best, choice available for how to proceed.
Thanks for outlining that history. Before we go to questions, Yuki, we've been talking about how scientists had this firsthand experience and these firsthand views. But can you talk about the experience of those who were on the receiving end of these bombings? Can you talk about the role that Hibakusha have played in understanding, how the world changed in 1945.
Sure. The Alex just told us about this San Francisco fire logic, which is fascinating. And I know that it's not your opinion, it's Alvarez was thinking. I often show this video, The Fog of the War, and there is a very interesting scene that's a documentary by Errol Morris and featuring Robert S. McNamara. And he's talking about the Second World War. And according to this film, prior to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, 51% of Tokyo was air raided, gone, which is equivalent to New York, and 40% of Nagoya, which is equivalent to Los Angeles, 35% of Osaka, which is equivalent to Chicago. So all those cities were bombarded and destroyed. Well, the question is, why didn't the Japanese government surrender, right? After all those cities were bombarded. But at the same time, Hiroshima was actually intact because people wanted to see the impact of the bombing. And by the end of December 1945, 140,000 people died from the bombing and in Hiroshima. And in Nagasaki, 72,400 people. And the number I'm using are from the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And often, saving lives, the bomb saved lives. And interestingly, there is a very good short article written by Stanford historian Barton Bernstein, who went into the documents, and then actually the number inflated. Before the news coming from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the estimate of the loss of American soldiers were 40,000 to 45,000. But then after Hiroshima and Nagasaki news came in, the number went up and then actually stopped the 500,000, which was used by Truman in his autobiography. But some people say more numbers. And so it is interesting how to think of these numbers, or should number matters. I mean, to some extent it does, but at the same time, it's not just numbers. And those are the actual people. So, but 80 years later, we have very few people who can talk about the experiences. But one of them is perhaps Hidankyo, which was awarded with Nobel Peace Prize 2024. And actually one of the leaders of that group, Masako Wada, I was able to be on the same panel this past August event. And I was able to attend the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Ceremony, which is not organized by the state, but actually by the city. And in that ceremony, Governor Yuzaki criticized the nuclear deterrence theory. And I think that it's because nuclear deterrence theory can be for the people who think that they were protected. The nuclear bombs could protect them. But actually, from the perspective of Hiroshima, they were not protected. And also, it's not just Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I also have friends in New Mexico, and indigenous people and Hispanic people. Those grandparents suffered from the first bombing and subsequent nuclear tests. And more importantly, I also want to emphasize that 10% of Hibakusha that suffer of the bombing in Hiroshima came from the Korean Peninsula. So which also suggests Japan's colonial policy. So all those things, I would like to, that complexity, I would like to bring on the table, and especially in the 80th anniversary, I would like to make it more universal issues. It's not just the scientists. Of course, that's an important part, very important part. But it's not just politicians, again, very important part, but also people who actually suffered from these weapons. All those people who could talk together, I think that would be very meaningful.
Okay, thanks for that. Got a ton of really good questions, so we'll try to get through as many as possible. Cindy, coming back to you, there's some questions you brought up, sort of the bifurcation of how scientists are viewing this. And we have a question about, did Operation Crossroads have effect on the discussions about international control? And is it accurate that Oppenheimer was opposed to Operation Crossroads? And maybe talk about what Operation Crossroads is.
Well, Operation Crossroads was the effort to kind of test the survivability of a fleet and, well, just see what the power of the bombs were. So it had a number of tests in the Pacific. Some of them were islands or atolls that were almost totally demolished. Oppenheimer did not want to go out to see the first demonstration that came shortly after the war, that the Navy had planned to use these ships to see could they withstand and how far away did they have to be, if we had a nuclear war. He said, we can predict that. He could do this math, and he didn't think that it was a good idea to detonate more atomic weapons, especially as we began to realize what the fallout contained and how dangerous that was to human life and the environment. So it was kind of the ramp up and the beginning of a whole number of testing that went on from the mostly in the 50s until the Cuban Missile Crisis sort of forced leaders to say, enough, we've got to ramp this down and only do underground testing. Too many lives are at stake. The world's future is at stake.
Thanks for that, Cindy. I actually had the privilege of visiting the Marshall Islands on the anniversary of the Castle Bravo test, which is the largest nuclear test the U.S. ever conducted. And it is another group of people, the Marshallese, who are affected there is a community that people need to hear from, and that lived experience is just as much of a part of this conversation as what our scientists have done. Alec, we have a couple of questions here about the relationship between Alvarez and Oppenheimer. One from Richard Caputo, who asks, what was Alvarez's main objection to Oppenheimer, so much so that he spoke against him? And we have another one from Farouk Hussein, who says, do you address Alvarez's advocacy of the H-bomb and his backing of Teller and Lawrence and testifying against Oppie in the loyalty hearings that resulted in the removal of the security clearances? So, does your book get into that? And he held what we would today describe as very right-wing views. Do you address the origins of this? I assume that's in reference to Alvarez. And I personally thought it was interesting, another thing I didn't know, that Alvarez and Leslie Groves had sort of a back channel conversation to include Alvarez sending Groves information about Oppenheimer's activities. So if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you or the people asked these questions, because this is a key part of the story. So when Oppenheimer goes to Alvarez to kind of pitch him on the idea of joining the Manhattan Project, he actually says, well, we've almost solved the fission bomb problem. And this is before they realized that implosion would pose so many challenges. And they're actually thinking about the fusion bomb, the hydrogen bomb, or the super. All right. And for Oppenheimer, this is like a selling point. He knows that Alvarez will want to work on this thing. And at the time, during the war, Oppenheimer does not seem to have any, or just doesn't raise any ethical objections to the idea of the super. And so after Russia detonates its first atomic bomb in 1949, Alvarez and Lawrence immediately think, well, we have to respond by developing the super. We have to develop the thermonuclear bomb to kind of stay ahead of the Russians in the arms race. And Alvarez assumes that Oppenheimer will agree. And he's actually very shocked when they are trying to make this case in Washington to discover that Oppenheimer is opposed, to the program. And Oppenheimer stays opposed to the program. Alvarez stays in favor of it. And this is kind of what defines their relationship for the next few years up until the Oppenheimer hearing. So my reading of the Oppenheimer hearing is that for at least some of the people involved, it was designed to sideline Oppenheimer because of his views on the thermonuclear bomb. The idea is that we want to get this program going. Oppenheimer is, by far the most influential voice, in this community. He's opposed to it. So for us to pursue, the H bomb, we have to kind of neutralize him. And that is the result. The result is that Oppenheimer's security clearance stays revoked. And Alvarez, he probably did have concerns about Oppenheimer's loyalty. There were things in Oppenheimer's background that I think raised some red flags for Alvarez and for Lawrence. But I think ultimately the motivation was they were both very strongly in favor of the thermonuclear bomb program. And they thought that it would have a better chance of succeeding in the long term if Oppenheimer were removed from the equation. And, it is a hard story to think about because they were friends. Oppenheimer and Alvarez were close. They'd worked together for years. But Oppenheimer, to Alvarez, they couldn't, they were never going to agree on this particular issue. And so I think Alvarez, along with Teller and Lawrence, kind of saw the hearing as, a convenient way to remove Oppenheimer from that conversation.
So much to dig through there. We'll come back around because there are a few more questions on that. But Yuki, we have a question from Anthony Vallion, who said, "What about the Soviet Union, declaring war on Japan in August 45? What influence did that have on the Japanese decision to surrender? And was it the combined effect of the bombings and the Soviet Union entering that theater of war that led to the end of the war?"
Right. Thank you for asking that question. And I think many historians would think that actually the Soviet invasion of the northern Manchuria or northern China, which Japan was occupying, was the decisive factor that Japan decided to surrender, because most of the how little, but most of the resources that they had back then were concentrated in the southern part. And because of this treaty between Japan and Soviet Union, the treaty was both countries were not attacking each other. So because of that treaty, Japan was not really sending the resources or soldiers to the northern part of its territory. However, this treaty came to an end. Between the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombings, and the Soviet Union didn't renew. So it was not them. It was not the Soviet Union breaching the treaty. It was just the end of the treaty. So they were able to invade Japan's territory. So that was, I think, it was a big blow, the final blow, I would say, to Japan's loss. So I think the person who raised this question, I think it's right. I think the person is right. This was a big decisive factor. And some historians think that knowing that Soviet Union was coming into East Asian area, the US kind of needed to drop the second atomic bomb, or actually third atomic bomb into Nagasaki so that they could have an upper hand. So they had already seen the post-war Japan's governance already, because it was kind of obvious that Japan was surrendering sooner or later, even though despite the general people's understanding. So I think that the some historians would say that the Cold War had already started then.
No, Cindy, we have a question. Perhaps you can dig into, it's okay if you can't, but from an anonymous attendee who asks, "We hear a lot about scientists' views about the bomb, but how much do we know about the views of the military officers involved in this operation and subsequently those who didn't know it was happening? And then sort of as a part of that, because you were talking a little bit about testing, Gary Jones said his uncle was one of the founders of the Atomic Veterans and a sailor on one of the ships at Bikini Atoll during the test. So can you address the impact of the nuclear age on U.S. veterans and citizens due to nuclear tests?
Well, let me take the first part of the question first, a little easier, but some of the scientists have been just overwhelmed when they have been at a military gathering of some sort. People absolutely thrilled that they succeeded in ending the war when they did. If you flew over the Pacific, I am told, between Hawaii and Japan, that you could almost walk from deck to deck. I mean, the U.S. ships, I mean, I may not have exactly where they were in the ocean, but there were so many preparing to invade. And the other point that kind of reinforces something that Yuki said was that the Japanese had amassed a lot of its resources in the southern part. They had known the plans for the invasion were to be in Kyushu, in the southern part of Japan. James Schlesinger, was former Secretary of Defense, spoke at a conference of ours and said that the usual ratio, in terms of military strategy, is you should have 3 times, the invader should have 3 times as many forces as the invadee. So you can overwhelm them. Obviously the person on the homeland behind the bunkers has a great advantage. But in this case, we had 300,000 forces ready to invade, or that was our plan. But the Japanese had taken troops over from Korea. They had taken them down. They had 900,000. That's what he said. So the numbers were flipped. Instead of the United States and the Allies having an advantage 3-1, the Japanese did. The other thing is that the Japanese were going to fight to the end. They don't have the word surrender in their vocabulary. There was such a military culture that they would, in Okinawa, they demonstrated the kamikaze pilots, the submarines, that sank. I mean, you just gave up your life, and that was fine. When they retreated from Saipan, they left thousands of military men there to starve. They didn't come back and rescue them. At any rate, it was a very different mentality. We sometimes forget, I guess. With respect to how did the second question was?
About veterans who were affected and citizens affected by nuclear testing.
You mean in the area in the Pacific? Well, I think we've touched on that a little bit. I mean, it was the long-term effects weren't well understood until years later. That's one thing the Japanese and the US worked on, and other international organizations, to try to understand the long-term effects of radiation program exposure. That's not to excuse it, but at any rate, what we know now is it was a horrific and a very, very bad idea. And it wasn't going to be that these islands would be, returned to the native populations anytime soon. We thought they would just, camp out over there for a while, but it was, some of them have never been able to go back to their homelands.
Yep. And for those of you who want to go down a rabbit hole, the origin story of Godzilla actually comes out of one of the U.S. tests with the Castle Bravo test in the Marshall Islands. Something people don't necessarily always know, that was the incarnation of Godzilla. So lots of stuff out on the internet if you'd like to go down that rabbit hole. We're running out of time. I want to give everybody a chance to just give a little assessment of, for the broader public, for the people watching, when they engage with their friends, their families, their colleagues, what is one thing that you think they need to take away from the history here as it applies to what we need to do now to reduce nuclear threats? So Yuki, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. I may be repeating myself, but I don't want the nuclear issues just to be those people who are policymakers. I think a couple of years ago, the city Chicago Council passed the resolution which says that kind of bluntly says that the residents of Chicago is paying $50 million. Let me I will check later, but $550 million per year to maintain the atomic bombs. And do we really want that resources to go into that direction? Or do we want to have a better public education or public transportation system, no food desert? You know, we have lots of issues in the city. So breaking down those issues, we tend to think like up there, bringing down to our everyday life, economics or post-colonial issues, as you know, Alex and Cindy were talking about the Marshall Island that was a territory of the United States, but of course, before 1945, Japan occupied it. So you know, so the colonial, post-colonial or decolonial issues and economic issues and all those everyday lives. And that's what I think, of course, it's important to have policy makers working on this, but we also have to work on ourselves on everyday life. This is about us. It's not like 80 years ago, those poor people suffered, you know, it's been happening after 1030 nuclear tests by the United States alone. So I would like to work with those people. Thank you.
Excellent. Cindy?
People have said that we need a big civil pushback. The Department of Energy, which, you know, is in charge of the nuclear weapons work, the modernization, I don't think many people look at their budget very closely. It's not something that's very public, or people are very aware that they are poised to spend $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years. And having worked in the Department of Energy, I know that these numbers start at 1.5 trillion, or you know, whatever. It ends up much bigger. At any rate, it's a huge investment that our country is poised to make. This is just reinforcing Yuki's point. Richard Rhodes once said, or he wrote in one of his quartet of books about war, that Gorbachev said we can't keep up with the United States, you know, escalation of the arsenal race, nuclear weapons race, that we've been bankrupting the Soviet Union. And Rhodes' comment was the United States was bankrupting the United States. I mean, in its obsession with building up 30,000 nuclear weapons and putting the whole country on this military front. And I mean, I hate to see a repeat of that. So I fully support greater education. People should visit the Manhattan Project National Historical Park sites. The National Park is very concerned to have a dialogue and talk about what happened under the mushroom cloud that's often, you know, airbrushed, and talk about where we are today.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Cindy. I think it perfectly captures the idea of those who are ignoring history are doomed to repeat it. So Alec, we'll leave you with the last word here.
Alex, sorry,
yeah.
just very quick. $500 million per year. That's the amount that Chicago residents are paying as tax in a form of tax. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. Thank you for the clarification. Alec, if you want to close up about, you know, what people should take away from Alvarez's legacy and what, you know, what really motivated you to bring, you know, this story, which has a huge nuclear component, to the public at this time.
Well, in the epilogue to the book, I like to point out that in the 70s, at the exact same time that Alvarez was working out at Berkeley, there were two other professors in Berkeley who were working on kind of a theory of problems, which they called wicked problems. This is Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber. And they draw a distinction between pain problems, which are the kinds of problems that have clear rules and objectives, that science and the tools of science are actually really good at addressing, and kind of wicked problems that, there's no obvious stopping point. Maybe the answers aren't true or false or better or worse. And you can't undo, an action once undertaken. And they note that it is a mistake to apply the tools of science to wicked problems. With the assumption that they can be addressed in the same ways that scientists solve problems that fall within their fields. And Alvarez talks about this. He's very clear that physics is very suited to addressing certain kinds of questions, but not others. And I think that's kind of like my big takeaway from his life, because he was the ultimate scientist in some ways, but also was, faced with certain problems that his skill set was not especially well suited to resolve. So I think it's important that we remember that some problems can be wonderfully addressed using the tools of science, and others can't. And it's important that we can tell the difference.
Excellent. That's a great summation and a good way to end. If we didn't get to your question, I'm so sorry. There's some really fantastic questions in here, but highly recommend that you go to the Atomic Heritage website. You read the scholarship of Yuki and pick up your own copy of Collisions to dig a little deeper. I'll also note that if you're a subscriber to the bulletin, you have access to all 80 years of our archives. So every article, including those from many of these scientists we've discussed today, are all there available for you firsthand. So thank you so much for all of you joining. I'd encourage you, to do further reading on the 80th anniversary of the bombings. It's incredibly important to understand the decisions of this era, how it's affecting our world today. Thank you again to our donors and subscribers. If you're watching and not yet a part of our network, again, please consider becoming a subscriber. Our next event will be in September, so keep an eye out for that. And finally, thank you so much to Cindy, Yuki, and Alec for a really great conversation, and we hope to have you guys back again soon.